The thunder cracked like a whip across the darkening Arizona sky, as Daniella Lowe urged her horse faster through the narrowing mountain pass. The year was 1885, and what had begun as a simple journey to visit her aunt in Prescott had transformed into a desperate race against the most violent storm Old Tucson had seen in decades. "Come on, Penny," Daniella pleaded with her chestnut mare, leaning forward in the saddle as the first heavy raindrops struck her face. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she glanced over her shoulder at the wall of black clouds pursuing her. The distant rumble of thunder had become a constant roar, drowning out even the sound of her horse's hooves against the rocky path. At 23, Daniella was no stranger to the unpredictable weather of the Arizona Territory. Born and raised on a small ranch outside Old Tucson, she had weathered many storms, but something about this one sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the rapidly dropping temperature. The wind suddenly shifted, howling through the canyon with such force that it nearly knocked Daniella from her saddle. Penny whinnied in terror, rearing up on her hind legs as a brilliant flash of lightning struck a nearby pine tree, sending it crashing across the trail before them. "Whoa, girl!" Daniella cried, pulling hard on the reins as her horse danced sideways in panic. "Easy now." Her words were cut short as another gust of wind tore through the canyon, this one carrying stinging hail that pelted both horse and rider mercilessly. Penny bolted, charging blindly off the trail and into the dense forest that blanketed the mountainside. Daniella fought for control, but the combination of wind, hail, and her horse's terror proved too much. A low-hanging branch caught her across the shoulder, and with a cry of pain, she was swept from the saddle. The world spun around her as she tumbled down a steep embankment, her body colliding with rocks and tree roots before coming to rest at the bottom of a ravine. Pain exploded through her leg and head as consciousness wavered. The last thing Daniella saw before darkness claimed her was Penny's retreating form, disappearing into the storm-lashed forest. Miles away in Old Tucson, Benjamin Caldwell stood at the window of the sheriff's office, watching the approaching storm with growing concern. At 32, Benjamin had spent enough years on the frontier to recognize trouble when he saw it. The way those clouds were building and the eerie green tint to the sky spoke of a dangerous tempest brewing. "Going to be a bad one," Sheriff Harmon remarked, coming to stand beside him. The older man's weathered face creased with worry as he stared at the distant lightning. "Anyone caught out in that is going to be in for a world of hurt," Benjamin nodded grimly. "I was thinking the same thing. Should we gather some men, check the outlying areas once it passes?" "Might be a good idea," the sheriff agreed, stroking his gray mustache thoughtfully. "Though I can't think of anyone who'd be fool enough to be traveling in this weather." A sudden commotion outside drew their attention. Benjamin stepped out onto the wooden porch just as a riderless chestnut mare galloped into town, sides heaving and eyes wild with fear. The horse was saddled but had clearly been traveling hard through rough country. "That's Daniella Lowe's horse," Mrs. Patterson called out from the general store doorway. "She left for Prescott this morning to visit her aunt." Benjamin's blood ran cold. He had known Daniella since she was a child, though in recent years their paths had crossed less frequently. Still, he remembered her as spirited and capable, not one to lose control of her horse easily, if Penny had returned without her. "Sheriff," Benjamin called over his shoulder, already moving to catch the frantic mare. "We've got trouble." By the time he had managed to calm the horse, a small crowd had gathered. Benjamin's experienced eyes noted the scratches on the mare's legs, and the way the saddle was tilted to one side, as though someone had been pulled from it violently. "That trail to Prescott goes through Bishop's Canyon," Benjamin said, his mind already mapping the terrain. "If she got caught in that storm up there." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Not much we can do until this passes. You know as well as I do that going up there now would be suicide." Benjamin knew the sheriff was right, but the thought of Daniella alone in that storm, possibly injured, made his chest tighten. "I'll gather supplies. The moment this weather breaks, I'm heading out." "I'll put together a search party," Sheriff Harmon offered, but Benjamin was already leading Penny to the stables, his jaw set in determination. "No time for that," he replied. "I know those mountains better than anyone. I'll find her faster on my own." The storm raged through the night with a fury that left even the oldest residents of Old Tucson shaken. Benjamin barely slept, spending the hours checking his gear and provisions. By first light, the storm had finally moved on, leaving behind a transformed landscape of mud, fallen trees, and swollen creeks. Benjamin saddled his stallion, Maverick, and secured his supplies. He packed bandages, splints, whiskey for disinfectant, dried beef, beans, coffee, and extra blankets. His Winchester rifle was secured in its scabbard, and his Colt revolver rode at his hip. If Daniella was out there, he would find her no matter what it took. "You're sure about going alone?" Sheriff Harmon asked as Benjamin prepared to depart. "The terrain will be treacherous after that storm." "All the more reason not to wait," Benjamin replied, swinging into the saddle. "Every hour counts now." He didn't voice his darkest fear that they might already be too late. As he rode out of town, Benjamin felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Daniella was well liked in Old Tucson, her sunny disposition and quick wit making her a favorite among the townspeople. Her parents had passed away 2 years prior, leaving her to run the small family ranch with only the help of an aging ranch hand. She was strong, but even the strongest could be broken by nature's fury. Benjamin urged Maverick into a canter as soon as they cleared the town limits, heading for the mountain trail that led to Bishop's Canyon. The path was indeed treacherous, with fallen trees and washouts forcing frequent detours. It was nearly noon when he reached the spot where the trail split, one fork continuing toward Prescott, the other descending into the canyon. Here, Benjamin dismounted and began his search in earnest, looking for any sign of Daniella's passage. Years of tracking experience served him well as he examined the muddy ground. Despite the rain that had washed away many traces, he eventually found what he was looking for: hoofprints heading into the canyon, their depth and spacing suggesting a horse moving at speed. "She was running from the storm," he muttered to himself, following the tracks. The trail led him deeper into the canyon, until he came across the fallen pine tree that blocked the path. Here, the tracks became confused, showing signs of a horse rearing, and then bolting sideways off the trail. Benjamin tied Maverick to a nearby tree and continued on foot, following the chaotic trail of broken branches and disturbed earth. His heart sank when he discovered a woman's hat caught on a thorn bush, a simple brown felt with a blue ribbon that he recognized as Daniella's. "Daniella." He called out, his voice echoing through the canyon. "Daniella Lowe." Only silence answered him. Benjamin pressed on, his experienced eyes scanning every inch of the forest floor. The signs led him to the edge of a steep embankment, and what he saw made his blood run cold: a clear trail where something or someone had tumbled down the slope. Without hesitation, Benjamin made his way carefully down the treacherous incline, sliding in the mud and catching himself on tree trunks. At the bottom of the ravine, he called out again, "Daniella." This time, a faint moan answered him. Benjamin rushed forward, following the sound until he found her. Daniella lay half concealed beneath a fallen branch, her dress torn and mudded, her face pale beneath a layer of dirt and dried blood from a cut on her forehead. Her right leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and her breathing came in shallow, pained gasps. "Daniella," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "It's Benjamin Caldwell. I've come to take you home." Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing pain-clouded hazel eyes. "Ben," she whispered hoarsely, "how did you?" "Your horse came back to town," he explained, gently brushing wet strands of dark hair from her face. "I've been tracking you since dawn." He worked quickly but carefully, assessing her injuries. The leg was broken, but thankfully the bone hadn't pierced the skin. She had a nasty gash on her head, several deep bruises, and was suffering from exposure, but she was alive, and that was what mattered most. "I need to splint that leg before we move you," Benjamin told her, pulling supplies from his pack. "This is going to hurt." Daniella nodded weakly. "Do what you must." Benjamin admired her courage as he fashioned a splint from branches and strips of cloth. When it came time to set the bone, she bit down on a folded bandana, muffling her scream of pain as he pulled the broken ends into alignment. Sweat beaded on her brow and tears streaked through the dirt on her cheeks, but she didn't beg him to stop. "You've always been tough," he said softly, securing the splint. "Even as a little girl." The ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You remember that?" "I remember a lot about you, Daniella Lowe," Benjamin replied, surprised by the truth in his words. Though they hadn't spoken much in recent years, he realized he had always kept track of her from a distance. After giving her water and a small sip of whiskey for the pain, Benjamin faced their next challenge, getting her out of the ravine. The slope was too steep and slippery to carry her up directly. They would need to follow the ravine until it leveled out enough for a safer ascent. "I can't leave you here while I get Maverick," he explained. "The ravine might flood if there's more rain. I'll need to carry you." Daniella nodded, though her face paled at the prospect of being moved. Benjamin fashioned a makeshift travois, but soon discovered it was impossible to pull through the dense underbrush of the ravine floor. With no other option, he carefully lifted Daniella into his arms, cradling her against his chest as he began the slow journey downstream. Despite her injuries, Daniella remained conscious, her body tense with pain but her mind alert. "You shouldn't have come alone," she murmured as he navigated around a fallen log. "It was dangerous. Would you have waited for a search party if it had been me out here?" Benjamin asked, knowing the answer. "No," she admitted with a faint smile. "I suppose not." They traveled slowly, with Benjamin stopping frequently to let her rest and to give her water. The afternoon wore on, the forest growing darker as clouds gathered once again overhead. Benjamin's muscles burned with the effort of carrying her, but he refused to stop. Each time he glanced down at her pale face, his determination renewed. "There was a time," Daniella said during one of their brief rests, "when half the girls in Old Tucson were sweet on you, Benjamin Caldwell." He chuckled, surprising himself. "Is that so?" she murmured, her eyes half closed with exhaustion. "The mysterious tracker who came and went like the wind, so handsome and brooding." "And what about you?" he asked, curiosity getting the better of him. "Were you one of those girls?" A flush that had nothing to do with fever colored her cheeks. "I was 16 when you left to scout for the army, too young to be noticed by the likes of you." Something in her tone made Benjamin wonder if there was more to that story, but this wasn't the time to press. Instead, he helped her take another sip of water and continued their journey. It was nearly dusk when they finally reached a point where the ravine walls sloped gently enough to climb. Benjamin was exhausted, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool air, but the sight of the easier path renewed his strength. Carefully, he began the ascent, mindful of each step on the slippery ground. Almost there, he encouraged Daniella, who had grown increasingly quiet as the day wore on. Her skin felt hot against his arms, too hot. Fever had set in, and Benjamin knew they needed shelter soon. Reaching the top of the ravine, Benjamin whistled for Maverick. To his relief, the loyal stallion had broken free of his tethering and followed along the ridge, staying close enough to hear his master's call. Within minutes, the horse appeared through the trees, snorting softly in greeting. "Good boy," Benjamin praised, carefully laying Daniella on a patch of soft grass while he reorganized their gear. The sky was darkening again, not just with evening but with more threatening clouds. They wouldn't make it back to town tonight, perhaps not even tomorrow if her condition worsened. "We need to find shelter," he told Daniella, helping her drink a little more water. "Can you stay on Maverick if I ride with you?" She nodded weakly. "I'll try." Getting her mounted was a painful ordeal that left her gasping and pale, but soon she was settled in front of Benjamin on the saddle, her splinted leg carefully positioned, her body supported by his arms as he held the reins. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles from here," Benjamin said, guiding Maverick carefully through the trees. "We can wait out the weather there." Daniella leaned back against his chest, her breathing shallow. "You know these mountains well." "I spent years exploring them," he replied, unconsciously tightening his protective hold around her waist. "After the war I needed space, peace." "Did you find it?" she asked softly. Benjamin considered her question as they rode. Had he found peace in his solitary wanderings? Or had he merely been hiding from the memories of battlefields and lost comrades? Before he could answer, Daniella spoke again. "I used to watch for you," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the sound of the horse's hooves. "Whenever you'd come back to town for supplies. I'd find reasons to be at the general store or the saloon." Surprised, Benjamin glanced down at her profile. "You did? Silly girlish fancy," she murmured, her eyes drifting closed. "You never noticed me." But he had noticed her, Benjamin realized with sudden clarity. He had watched her grow from a spirited girl into a beautiful young woman, had observed from a distance as she handled her parents' deaths with quiet dignity, had admired her determination to keep their ranch running against all odds. Perhaps he had kept his distance deliberately, believing someone like her deserved better than a man haunted by war and wilderness. "I noticed," he said simply, but Daniella had slipped into unconsciousness, her head lolling against his shoulder. Alarmed by her deteriorating condition, Benjamin urged Maverick faster through the gathering darkness. Rain began to fall again, gently at first, then with increasing intensity as night descended fully. By the time they reached the cabin, both were soaked to the skin, and Daniella's fever burned hotter than ever. The cabin was crude but sound, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough plank floor, and a narrow cot against one wall. Benjamin kicked the door shut against the wind and rain, then gently laid Daniella on the cot. Working quickly, he built a fire in the hearth from the dry wood stacked beside it, grateful that the cabin had been maintained by whoever used it last. As warmth slowly filled the small space, Benjamin turned his attention to Daniella. Her clothes were soaked and muddy, her skin alternately flushed with fever and pale with shock. He knew what needed to be done, though the thought made his neck warm with embarrassment. "Daniella," he said, touching her cheek gently. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered open, her gaze unfocused. "Cold," she whispered. "So cold." "I need to get you out of these wet clothes," he explained, his voice steady despite his discomfort. "You'll catch pneumonia otherwise." She nodded faintly, understanding despite her delirium. Benjamin worked as efficiently and respectfully as possible, removing her torn dress and petticoats, leaving her in her chemise and drawers. He covered her immediately with the rough blanket from his pack, then added his own coat for extra warmth. Her skin felt like fire when he touched her forehead. Benjamin searched through his supplies for the willow bark he carried for pain and fever, brewing a strong tea in a tin cup over the fire. Supporting her head, he helped her drink the bitter concoction. "Rest now," he told her, brushing damp hair from her brow. "I'll keep watch." Through the night, Benjamin tended to Daniella's fever, applying cool cloths to her forehead and neck, helping her sip water and willow bark tea whenever she was conscious enough to swallow. He checked her splint, relieved to find no signs of dangerous swelling or infection in the broken leg. The head wound concerned him more. Such injuries could turn deadly with little warning. Outside, the storm raged once more, rain hammering against the cabin roof and wind howling through the trees. Benjamin stoked the fire and spread his own clothes to dry, sitting beside Daniella's cot in just his long underwear and shirt. As he watched the firelight play across her feverish face, he found himself speaking softly to her. "I did notice you, Daniella," he admitted to her unconscious form. "How could I not? But a man like me. I've seen too much, done too much. You deserve someone whole." He told her about the war, about the years afterward when he couldn't bear to be around people for long, how tracking and hunting in the wilderness had slowly healed something broken inside him, how he'd started to think about settling down just when she'd suffered the loss of her parents. "I should have offered help then," he said with regret. "Instead, I kept my distance, thought you'd be better off without a broken man's sympathy." Somewhere in the early morning hours, Daniella's fever broke. Benjamin had dozed off in his chair, exhaustion finally claiming him, when a soft touch on his hand startled him awake. Daniella was looking at him, her eyes clear for the first time since he'd found her. "You're not broken," she whispered. "Just wounded. There's a difference." Benjamin stared at her, wondering how much of his midnight confession she had heard. "How are you feeling?" he asked, deliberately changing the subject as he reached for her forehead. Her skin was cool and slightly damp, a good sign. "Like I fell down a mountain," she replied with a weak smile. "But I'll live thanks to you." The rain had stopped by dawn, though heavy clouds still hung over the mountains. Benjamin stepped outside briefly to check on Maverick and gather more firewood, returning to find Daniella attempting to sit up. "Easy," he cautioned, hurrying to support her. "That leg needs time to heal." "I can't lie here forever," she protested, though she accepted his help in adjusting her position. "How far are we from town?" "At least a day's ride in good conditions," Benjamin replied, building up the fire. "And these aren't good conditions. The trails will be washed out, maybe impassable in places. We're better off staying put another day, letting you regain some strength." Daniella looked like she wanted to argue but nodded reluctantly. "I suppose you're right." Benjamin prepared a simple breakfast of coffee and beans from his supplies. As they ate, he noticed Daniella watching him with an intensity that made him self-conscious. "What?" he asked finally. "I'm trying to reconcile the Benjamin Caldwell I thought I knew with the man who tracked me through a storm and carried me for miles," she replied. "The man who sat up all night tending my fever." Benjamin busied himself with his coffee cup. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly. "Not anyone. Most would have waited for the search party. Most would have given up when they saw how difficult the terrain was." She paused, then added softly, "Thank you for not giving up." Their eyes met across the small cabin, and something shifted in the air between them. Benjamin looked away first, suddenly aware of the intimacy of their situation alone in a remote cabin, Daniella in her undergarments beneath the blanket, himself hardly more dressed. "We should check your injuries," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. The day passed slowly as the rain returned intermittently. Benjamin redressed Daniella's head wound, pleased to see it was healing cleanly. Her leg remained securely splinted, though she winced with every small movement. By evening, her fever showed no signs of returning, but Benjamin remained vigilant, preparing more willow bark tea as a precaution. As night fell once more, Benjamin made a pallet for himself on the floor near the fire, giving Daniella privacy on the cot. They talked long into the evening about old Tucson, about the years since they'd last truly spoken, about their lives and dreams. Benjamin found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone, about both the horrors and rare moments of beauty he'd witnessed during the war. "Is that why you keep to yourself so much?" Daniella asked. "Because of what you saw?" Benjamin stared into the flames. "Partly. After seeing that much death, it changes how you look at life, makes connections seem both more precious and more frightening." "Frightening," he nodded. "To care about someone is to risk losing them. I've lost enough. But to never care is to lose everything before you even have it," Daniella countered softly. Benjamin looked up at her then, struck by the wisdom in her words. She met his gaze steadily, her hazel eyes reflecting the firelight. In that moment, he saw not just the beautiful young woman she had become, but the strong soul beneath someone who had faced her own losses, yet remained open to life and its possibilities. "Get some rest," he said finally, unable to find the right words for what he was feeling. "We'll try for town tomorrow if the weather holds." Morning brought clearing skies and the decision to attempt the journey back to Old Tucson. Benjamin fashioned a more comfortable arrangement on Maverick, creating a secure seat where Daniella could ride with her splinted leg properly supported. Getting her mounted was painful but necessary, and soon they were making their slow way down from the mountains. The going was difficult, with Benjamin leading Maverick on foot through the worst sections of trail. What should have been a half-day journey stretched into a full day as they navigated around washouts and fallen trees. Benjamin maintained a constant awareness of Daniella's condition, stopping frequently to let her rest and ease the pain of the jolting ride. During one such stop, as they shared the last of Benjamin's jerky beneath the branches of a towering pine, Daniella suddenly laughed a bright, unexpected sound that made Benjamin look at her in surprise. "What's so amusing?" he asked. "Us," she replied, gesturing between them. If someone had told me a week ago that I'd be stranded in the wilderness with Benjamin Caldwell as my rescuer and nurse, I'd have thought them crazy. Benjamin couldn't help but smile. Life has strange ways of bringing people together. "Indeed it does," she agreed, her expression sobering. "Ben, when we get back to town, what happens then?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" Daniella hesitated, then met his eyes directly. "Do we go back to being strangers who barely speak when they pass on the street, or has something changed?" The directness of her question was so characteristic of her that Benjamin almost laughed. Instead, he found himself considering his answer carefully. "I'd like to think something has changed," he said finally. "These past days, I've remembered what it feels like to have someone to care for. Someone who matters." A smile bloomed across Daniella's face, warming Benjamin more thoroughly than any fire could have. "You matter to me too," she said simply. "You always have." They reached the outskirts of Old Tucson as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the dusty Main Street. Word of their approach spread quickly, and by the time they reached the doctor's house, a small crowd had gathered. Eager hands reached up to help Daniella down from Maverick's back, and Benjamin found himself suddenly relegated to the background as Dr. Morris took charge of her care. "You found her," Sheriff Harmon said, clapping a hand on Benjamin's shoulder. "Never doubted you would." Benjamin nodded, his eyes fixed on Daniella as she was carried into the doctor's house. She's strong. Survived a broken leg and head wound that would have killed most. And you look like you've been through the ringer yourself, the sheriff observed. Go get yourself cleaned up and rested. She's in good hands now. Reluctantly, Benjamin allowed himself to be guided away. He stabled Maverick, then made his way to his small cabin at the edge of town. The familiar space felt oddly empty as he bathed and changed into clean clothes. For the first time in years, the solitude he had always cherished felt more like isolation. He tried to sleep, but found himself restless, his thoughts constantly returning to Daniella. Was she comfortable? Had the doctor confirmed his assessment of her injuries? Would she heal completely? Eventually, he gave up on sleep and returned to town, making his way to the doctor's house despite the late hour. Dr. Morris was just stepping out onto the porch when Benjamin approached. The older man nodded in greeting, unsurprised by his appearance. "I figured you'd be back," he said. "She's resting comfortably. You did a fine job with that splint, saved her from a compound fracture that might have cost her the leg." Relief washed through Benjamin. "And the head wound." "Also healing well. She's a lucky young woman, or rather, fortunate in her rescuer." The doctor studied Benjamin's face thoughtfully. "She's been asking for you." "She has." Benjamin couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. Dr. Morris chuckled. "Repeatedly." "I finally promised I'd send word if you showed up, just to get her to take the laudanum and rest." He gestured toward the door. "Go on in. Just keep it brief. She needs sleep more than conversation." Benjamin entered the doctor's house quietly, finding Daniella in a small bedroom off the main examination room. She lay propped up on pillows, her splinted leg elevated, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She appeared to be sleeping, but as he turned to leave, her eyes opened. "You came," she said, her voice husky with medication and fatigue. "Of course," he replied, moving to stand beside her bed. "How are you feeling?" "Floating," she admitted with a drowsy smile. "Dr. Morris gave me something for the pain. He says you saved my leg." Benjamin shook his head. "You would have done the same for me." "I would have tried," she agreed, reaching out her hand to him. After a moment's hesitation, he took it, surprised by how right it felt to have her fingers twined with his. "I was afraid," she confessed suddenly, "that once we were back in town, you would retreat again. Become the solitary Benjamin Caldwell that everyone admires from a distance but no one really knows." Her perception cut close to the truth. It would be easy to fall back into old patterns, to convince himself that their connection had been merely the product of extraordinary circumstances. "I'm here now," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "Promise me something," Daniella said, fighting against the pull of the laudanum. "Promise you'll still be here tomorrow, and the day after." Benjamin looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face, open and vulnerable in a way that touched something deep within him. "I promise," he said, and meant it. True to his word, Benjamin returned the next day and every day after that during Daniella's recovery at the doctor's house. He brought books to read to her, news from town, and occasionally wildflowers that made her smile in delight. When she was finally allowed to return to her small ranch 2 weeks later, it was Benjamin who carried her to the wagon and drove her home. The aging ranch hand, Miguel, had kept things running in her absence, but there was much that needed a stronger back and more capable hands. Without being asked, Benjamin began making repairs to the barn and corral fencing, mending the roof that had been damaged in the storm, and helping with the daily chores that Daniella couldn't manage with her healing leg. As spring turned to summer, his visits became longer, his departures more reluctant. Sometimes he would stay for supper, lingering afterward to talk with Daniella on the porch as the sunset painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson. They spoke of everything and nothing: her plans for the ranch, his knowledge of the mountains, shared memories of old Tucson's past, and cautious hopes for the future. By midsummer, Daniella was walking with the aid of a cane, her leg healing well though Dr. Morris warned it might always pain her in cold weather. Benjamin was there the day she took her first unaided steps across the porch, his face lighting with pride at her accomplishment. "Soon you won't need me around at all," he teased, though a part of him feared the truth in those words. Daniella looked at him steadily, the directness of her gaze unchanged by all they had been through. "Is that what you think? That I keep you around because I need help with chores?" Benjamin shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable. "The ranch is running smoothly again. Your leg is healing. Life is returning to normal. And normal means you go back to your solitary cabin and I stay here alone," she challenged, her chin lifting in that stubborn way he had come to adore. "Is that what you want, Benjamin?" "No," he admitted quietly. "It's not what I want. But I'm not sure I know how to be anything other than what I've been these past years." Daniella moved closer, her steps careful but determined. "You've already shown that's not true. These past months, you've been everything I could have hoped for: kind, attentive, patient." She reached up to touch his cheek gently. "You've let me see the man behind the legend of Benjamin Caldwell, the brooding tracker, and I happen to like that man very much." Benjamin covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press a kiss against her palm. The gesture came naturally, though it was the first time he had allowed himself such intimacy. "I more than like you, Daniella Lowe," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I've been half in love with you for years without admitting it to myself, and these past months—" He shook his head, overwhelmed by feelings he had kept contained for too long. "These past months have only confirmed what I should have known all along." Daniella's eyes shone with unshed tears. "And what is that?" "That loving someone isn't just risking loss," he said, echoing their conversation from the cabin. "It's embracing the possibility of joy. And you, Daniella, you make me believe in joy again." The kiss they shared then was tender and tentative, a beginning rather than a culmination. When they parted, Daniella was smiling through her tears. "Stay for supper?" she asked, as she had so many evenings before. Benjamin smiled back, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I'll stay as long as you'll have me." As summer faded into autumn, Benjamin spent more nights at the ranch than at his own cabin. Old Tucson buzzed with gossip about the unlikely romance between the solitary tracker and the spirited young rancher, but neither Benjamin nor Daniella paid much attention to the talk. They were too busy building something neither had expected to find: a partnership based on mutual respect, shared hardship, and deepening love. On the 1-year anniversary of the storm that had nearly claimed Daniella's life, Benjamin took her riding into the foothills where wildflowers carpeted the normally harsh landscape. They picnicked beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree, and when Daniella unwrapped her portion of cornbread, she found a simple gold ring nestled within. She looked up to find Benjamin watching her nervously, his usual confidence replaced by vulnerable hope. "I'm not a man of fancy words," he said quietly, "but I know what I want now, Daniella. I want a life with you. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I want to build something lasting together." He took a deep breath. "Will you marry me?" Daniella's answer was to launch herself into his arms with such enthusiasm that they both tumbled backward onto the blanket, laughing as he caught her against his chest. "Is that a yes?" he asked, grinning up at her. "Yes," she confirmed, kissing him soundly. "1,000 times yes." They were married in the small church in Old Tucson, as autumn painted the desert in russet and gold. The entire town turned out for the celebration, delighted to witness the union of two people who had overcome so much to find each other. Sheriff Harmon stood as Benjamin's best man, while Mrs. Patterson, who had first identified Penny's riderless return, served as Daniella's matron of honor. After the ceremony, as they greeted well-wishers outside the church, Dr. Morris approached with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "in my 40 years of practice, I've seen all manner of injuries and ailments, but sometimes I think the most powerful medicine isn't found in my doctor's bag at all." "What do you mean?" Daniella asked, her arm linked through Benjamin's. The doctor smiled. "I mean that what heals us most completely is often the willingness of one person to search tirelessly for another, to carry them when they cannot walk, to stay beside them through pain and recovery." He looked between them with approval. "You two have already practiced the best part of your wedding vows in sickness and in health." Benjamin tightened his arm around Daniella's waist. "The storm may have brought us together, but it's our choice to stay that way. The best choices often come after the worst storms, Doctor." Morris observed wisely. In the years that followed, Benjamin and Daniella Caldwell built a life that neither had dared to imagine before that fateful storm. They expanded the ranch, breeding some of the finest horses in the Arizona Territory. Benjamin still occasionally took tracking jobs for the sheriff, but he never strayed far or long from home. His skills as a woodworker emerged as he crafted furniture for their growing household, each piece made with the same care and attention he had once reserved for surviving in the wilderness. Daniella's leg healed completely, though it did indeed pain her when rain was coming, making her, as she joked, better than any weather vane. She kept the ranch's books, haggled fiercely with cattle buyers, and earned a reputation as a fair but formidable businesswoman. 2 years after their wedding, their family expanded with the birth of their son, Matthew, who inherited his mother's spirit and his father's quiet strength. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 3 years later with her father's dark eyes and her mother's determined chin. On stormy nights, the children would beg to hear the tale of how their parents met, how their mother had been lost in a terrible tempest, and their father had tracked her through impossible conditions, never giving up until he found her. Benjamin and Daniella would exchange knowing glances over their children's heads, silently acknowledging the parts of the story that remained private between them, the confessions in the cabin, the slow awakening of feelings long denied, the journey from strangers to lovers that had been far more complex than any children's tale could capture. On the 10th anniversary of that life-changing storm, Benjamin surprised Daniella with a gift, a small carved wooden box inlaid with turquoise. Inside lay a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a compass rose. "So you'll always find your way home," he said, as he fastened it around her neck. "Though I'll still come looking for you if you ever get lost again." Daniella touched the pendant gently, then looked up at the man who had transformed from the solitary tracker into her husband, partner, and best friend. "I was never truly lost," she said softly. "I was just waiting for you to find me." As they stood together on the porch of their ranch house, watching their children play in the yard, and the sun set over the mountains that had both separated and united them, Benjamin reflected on how a single storm had altered the course of their lives. What might have been tragedy had instead become the beginning of their greatest joy. "Any regrets?" Daniella asked, seeming to read his thoughts as she often did. Benjamin shook his head, pulling her close against his side. "Not one," he assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Every trail led me where I was meant to be, right here, with you." And as the first stars appeared in the darkening Arizona sky, Benjamin Caldwell, once the loneliest man in Old Tucson, held his family close, grateful for the storm that had shown him the way home.